The first thing Myra noticed when she walked into the grand hall that evening was that nobody looked at her. Not a single head turned, not one pair of eyes lifted from their conversations, their goblets, their careful political smiles. 200 wolves filled the marble hall of Crestone Palace, and not one of them saw her enter. She was wearing a deep navy dress that cost more than anything she had ever owned before coming here, her hair pinned with a silver clasp that caught the chandelier light, her shoes silent on the polished stone floor. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman worth noticing. But she had learned, in 3 years of living inside these walls, that she was not meant to be noticed. She was meant to be present. There was a difference, and it had taken her longer than she cared to admit to understand it. She moved along the left edge of the hall, close to the tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens. The gardens were lit with lanterns tonight, small golden points of light strung between the old oak trees, and from where she stood the whole thing looked like a painting, beautiful, distant, and not meant to be touched. She found an empty stretch of wall near the third window and stopped there, holding a glass of sparkling water she had taken from a passing tray, not because she was thirsty, but because having something to hold made standing alone look less like what it was. 3 years ago, she would have found this unbearable. 3 years ago, she had been 22 and new to everything, and she had made the mistake of believing that being brought to the Alpha King's palace meant something. She had arrived in a car she had never ridden in before, through iron gates she had never seen before, into rooms so large and still and full of deliberate silence that she had felt, for the first 3 weeks, like a person who had accidentally wandered into someone else's very important life. She had waited to feel at home. She had waited to feel wanted. She had waited for a great many things, and one by one, quietly and without ceremony, she had stopped waiting for them. That was the version of herself she had left behind somewhere in the long corridors of this palace. That girl, hopeful and bright-eyed and a little trusting, had dissolved slowly into the marble floors like water into stone. What remained was Myra as she was now, composed, watchful, present without ever being fully here. She sipped her water and watched the room. The gala tonight was the Midsummer Summit, the one gathering each year where representatives from all 5 packs gathered under one roof. The Ironwood pack had sent their second and 3 senior wolves. The Greystone pack had come in full numbers, their delegation occupying an entire corner of the hall with the loud, cheerful confidence of people who believed they owned every room they entered. The Ashford pack, smaller and older and more careful with their words, had their matriarch at the center, a silver-haired woman named Elda who had been attending these gatherings since before Myra was born. The Coldwater pack's alpha had sent his eldest daughter as proxy, a young woman named Celia who stood very straight and spoke very little and watched everything with the kind of attention that made you feel your thoughts were being read. And presiding over all of it, at the center of the room in every sense that word could mean, was Caius. Alpha King Caius Varan, 34 years old, ruler of the 5 packs for 7 years. Tall enough that he stood a head above most of the men around him, with dark hair and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been put there by someone who was trying to make a point. He wore no crown. Caius considered crowns theatrical and had said so in those exact words at his own coronation. He wore a dark suit instead, perfectly fitted, and he stood in the middle of a circle of pack leaders and senior wolves with the easy, unhurried authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been unsure of whether he belonged somewhere. Myra had spent 3 years trying to understand him and had mostly succeeded in understanding only this. Caius Varan was a man built entirely of control. Every word he spoke was chosen. Every expression that crossed his face was permitted to be there. Nothing happened on his face by accident, nothing slipped past his guard without his permission, and this made him, in public, at events like this one, almost impossible to read. She had spent 3 years living in the same palace as him, and she was still not sure on most days what he actually thought about her. In the early months, she had paid close attention to the small things, the way he addressed her at dinner, formally and politely, with the same even tone he used with his household staff, the way he included her in certain functions but not others, as though there were an invisible line drawn somewhere and she perpetually lived on the wrong side of it. The way he never explained his decisions to her, never asked her opinion, never walked past her in a corridor and stopped just to speak about anything at all. She had interpreted this at first as reserve. People with power were often reserved. She had told herself he was simply a private person, that the distance between them would close naturally, that she simply needed to be patient. But 3 years was a long time to be patient, and patience, she had come to understand, was another word for standing against a wall holding a glass of sparkling water while 200 people did not look at you. She was not angry about it. That was the thing she had worked hardest to achieve, this absence of anger, and she had mostly achieved it. Anger required a particular kind of hope. You had to believe something could be different in order to feel angry that it was not. Myra had released that hope slowly, like air from a balloon, one small breath at a time, until there was nothing left to be angry about. What remained in the space where the anger had been was something quieter and harder to name. It felt on most days like being a photograph of yourself, present in the room, recognizably you, but flat and unable to step forward. She was thinking this, in the tired and automatic way she thought most things now, when someone said her name. Not the formal version, not the careful way the household staff said it, or the strange, weightless way Caius said it when he addressed her at official functions. Her name. Her actual name, with the short vowel in the middle that people often got wrong, said perfectly, by someone who knew exactly how it sounded. She turned. He was leaning against the window frame 2 panels over from where she stood, a glass in his hand, and an expression on his face that was simply open. Not performing openness, not manufacturing warmth. Actually open the way some people simply were, the way she had forgotten people could be. Myra, he said again, smiling, I thought that was you. You look at walls the same way you did 2 years ago. She blinked. She recognized him then in pieces, the way memory works when something has been filed away somewhere quiet. The Greystone Summit, 2 years prior. A conversation in a side corridor during a function very much like this one. He had been standing with his PAX delegation, and had separated from them to ask her which of the 2 doors at the end of the hall led to the terrace. And then somehow they had talked for 20 minutes about nothing much and everything small, and she had laughed, which she had not expected to do. His name was Darian, Bater of the Ironwood Pack. She remembered now that he had kind eyes, not arranged to look kind, not performing it, actually kind in a way that was visible, which was rarer than it should have been. Darian, she said. You remembered. He said it with genuine pleasure, as though being remembered by her was a thing worth being pleased about. She felt something shift slightly in her chest. A small thing barely noticeable, the way a door shifts when someone opens a window in another room. A change in pressure, almost nothing. How long have you been standing over there? She asked. About 10 minutes, he said. I was deciding whether to come over. I did not want to interrupt whatever extremely important thing you were doing with that wall. She laughed. It came out small and surprised, the way laughter does when it arrives before you have decided to let it. He moved to stand beside her, close enough for conversation, far enough for courtesy. He was easy to stand next to. That was the only way she could describe it. Easy. The way some people took up the right amount of space, and did not seem to need anything from you while also managing to make you feel, somehow, that their company was a kind of gift. They talked. It was simple and unplanned and ran in small, natural loops the way good conversations do. He told her about the drive to Crestholme from the Ironwood territory, which had taken 7 hours and had included a stop at a roadside place that served what he described as the most honest soup in the north. She told him that she had not left the palace grounds in 4 months, and he looked at her with something careful in his expression when she said it, but he did not comment. They talked about the Greystone delegation's habit of occupying every room they entered, as though they had personally built it. They talked about Elda, the Ashvin matriarch, and agreed that she was almost certainly the most intelligent person in the room. They talked about small things, and the small things felt, for the first time in a very long while, like enough. At some point the orchestra shifted into something slower, the kind of music that opens space in a room. Darian set his glass down on the windowsill and turned to her. Would you like to dance? He said. It was so straightforward, not performed, not strategically offered, just a question, asked by a man who simply wanted to dance and was asking the person standing next to him if she felt the same. Myra looked across the hall. Caius was still in his circle. Still talking, his profile turned toward her at a slight angle, his attention locked on whatever conversation was happening around him. He had not looked at her once since she entered the hall. He had not acknowledged her arrival. He was not looking at her now. She turned back to Darian. Yes, she said. She took his hand when he offered it, and they moved onto the dance floor together, and the music caught them and she let it. And for the first time in a very long time, standing in a room full of wolves, Myra did not feel like a photograph. She felt like a person. She felt like herself. And somewhere across the room, at the exact moment she turned her face toward Darian's and smiled at something he said, a glass stopped halfway to a pair of lips. And the Alpha King of 5 packs went completely, absolutely still. He did not put the glass down, he did not finish lifting it. He simply stopped, suspended between two actions, and his eyes, dark and unreadable and always controlled, fixed themselves on the dance floor. On her hand in another man's hand. On her smile, which he had not seen in months. On the space that Darian occupied beside her, which was, Caius realized with a shock of feeling so foreign he almost did not recognize it, a space he had never occupied himself. Nobody around him noticed. The conversation continued on both sides of him. Someone asked him a question and he answered it because his voice still worked, because a king's voice always worked, because years of training did not fail in a single moment even when everything else was failing at once. But underneath that training, in the part of him that was not a king, in the part of him that was simply a wolf, old and instinctive, and not governed by strategy or protocol or carefully maintained distance, something very old and very loud began to move. It did not roar, it did not make a scene. It simply woke up. And it looked at the dance floor. And it said, "That is mine." Myra did not know this. She was laughing at something Darian had said about the size of the chandelier overhead, tipping her head back slightly, and the chandelier light caught her silver clasp, and the line of her throat, and the honest, unguarded expression on her face, honest in a way she never was when she was being watched by anyone who mattered. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know that 20 meters away, the most controlled man she had ever met was standing very still with a glass halfway to his mouth, and 3 years of deliberate distance dissolving at the rate of approximately 1 second per heartbeat. She was dancing. For the first time in a long time she was simply dancing, and it felt like freedom. The song played on. His glass never reached his mouth. And across the grand marble hall of Crestone Palace, with 200 wolves as witnesses, something that had been carefully, deliberately still for 3 long years finally began to move, and it was not going to be easy to stop. Not tonight, not ever again. She kept dancing, her face soft and open, and turned toward a man who had simply asked, simply offered, simply treated her like a person in a room and not a piece of furniture someone had arranged beside a window. And the Alpha King watched every single second of it. He had no one to blame but himself. He knew that. He had known it for a while, in the way you know a thing you have decided not to look at. He had made choices. Deliberate choices, chosen for reasons he had believed were good. A king could not afford softness, the decisions ahead were complex, and so he had kept the distance, maintained it daily, treated her with courtesy and nothing else. He had believed the distance was working. He watched her dance. He understood in this moment, with the cold, quiet precision of a man confronting an error too large for excuses, that the distance had not been working at all. It had simply been moving something further from him that was now in someone else's hands. The song had 2 more minutes. He counted them. He did not move. He stood and he counted and he watched, and something inside him that was not patient the way a king is patient, not quiet the way a king is quiet, was running out of time. 2 minutes. He counted every second. The morning after her arrival at Crestone Palace, 3 years before the gala that would change everything, Myra had woken before sunrise. She had lain in the enormous bed in the room they had given her, a guest suite on the East Wing's 3rd floor, large enough that her entire childhood bedroom could have fit inside it twice, and stared at a ceiling she did not recognize in a darkness that smelled of stone and old wood and something faintly floral, and she had thought, "What have I done?" Not in panic, not in regret, in the quiet, clear-headed way she thought most things. With a kind of steady assessment, her eyes open, her hands folded on the covers, going through the facts of her situation the way you sort through the contents of a bag when you need to understand what you have to work with. She was 22. She had come from a small pack in the eastern borderlands, the Fenmark Pack, 300 members, nobody particularly important, a pack that existed peacefully and quietly and produced nothing remarkable and made no enemies. Her family was ordinary. Her mother ran a bakery. Her father worked in the pack's administrative office, managing schedules and supplies with the contented ease of a man who had found exactly the right life for himself. She had 2 older brothers who were louder than her and a younger sister who was quieter, and she had grown up in the middle of that noise and that silence and had been, by most measures, happy. She was not unhappy now, she was simply recalibrating. The arrangement had come through official channels, which was how these things always happened in the pack world. The Alpha King's household had reached out to the Fenmark Pack's Alpha with a request. The king required a companion for official functions, a woman of good standing who could be present at summit events and diplomatic gatherings as a representative of the broader pack community rather than any single high-ranking family. It was a position that had existed for centuries in one form or another. Her Alpha had brought it to her personally, not as a command because these requests were never commands, not officially, but with the particular gravity of a man presenting an opportunity that it would be difficult to decline without very good reasons. She had listened, she had thought, she had asked 3 questions, all practical, she had said yes. She had said yes because she was 22 and had never been anywhere in the world inside the Fenmark Pack's borders, lovely as it was, had started to feel like a room she had memorized. She had said yes because her instincts told her to, and her instincts were usually reliable. She had said yes because there was a part of her, quiet and unspoken, that had always believed she was meant for something she could not yet see. She had not, if she was honest with herself in the gray pre-dawn of that first morning, expected to feel so immediately, so completely invisible. She had met Caius the afternoon of her arrival. He had come to the formal sitting room on the 2nd floor, arrived exactly on time with 2 members of his household staff and his second, a broad-shouldered man named Grant who had the watchful stillness of someone who had spent 20 years learning to see everything without reacting to any of it. Caius had shaken her hand. He had told her she was welcome in his house. He had asked if her journey had been comfortable. She had said yes. He had told her that his household manager, a brisk and organized woman named Helena, would explain the schedule and the expectations of her role, and then he had excused himself. He had been in the room for 8 minutes. He had been courteous for every one of them. She had sat alone afterward in the formal sitting room for a while, looking at the space where he had been, and had thought, all right then. That was the moment she understood what she had actually agreed to, not a relationship, not a connection, not the beginning of something, a role, a function, a presence. She was there to occupy a space, to stand beside him at the right events, to represent something, to exist in his household in the correct way. Nothing more was offered and nothing more was expected. 3 years ago, that realization had hurt in a small, specific way that she had not let herself dwell on. Now standing in the palace kitchen at 6 in the morning on the day after her arrival, making herself tea because she had not yet learned where anything was and had found the tea bags by pure luck in the 3rd cupboard she opened, she decided to be practical about it. She could work with a role. She was good at roles. She had always been the middle child, the one who held things together, the one who understood the structure of a situation and operated within it with minimum friction. She sipped her tea by the kitchen window while the sun came up over the palace gardens, and the gardeners arrived and began their day, and she thought, this can be fine. This is a place and a position, and it has its own good things, and I can find those good things and hold on to them. She was good at finding good things. She found them steadily over the first months. The library, which was the most extraordinary room she had ever stood in, 3 floors of shelves, a rolling ladder on brass rails, tall windows with window seats deep enough to sleep in. The palace gardens in the early morning before anyone else was in them, the light low and gold and the birds unreasonably loud. Helena, the household manager, who was precise in the way that efficient people are precise, not unkind, just economical with softness, but who, once she understood that Myra was capable and willing and not going to cause trouble, treated her with a practical warmth that Myra appreciated more than she showed. She made a life from these things. It was a quiet life, but it was hers, and she built it carefully, and it held. And Caius was the weather. He was the large, significant, always-present force that she organized her days around without ever directly engaging with. She knew his schedule the way she knew the season, by its effects. When he was in residence, the palace had a particular energy, a tightness in the staff's posture, a precision in the timing of meals. When he traveled to other pack territories, the palace exhaled. Things became slightly looser, slightly more comfortable, and Myra found that she moved more freely in the rooms, as though the space itself expanded when he was gone. She attended the functions she was required to attend. She stood where she was told to stand. She wore the correct things. She was introduced at every function as the king's companion, and she accepted the title without expression because expression would have cost her something she was not prepared to spend. She watched him at these functions with the focused attention of someone studying a subject they could not quite solve. He was, and this was the thing that made him most difficult to set aside entirely, not a bad person. She had expected to discover over time that he was cold or careless or unfair in the small, private ways that powerful people sometimes were. Instead, she had discovered that he was serious, deeply, truly serious in a way that went all the way down to the bone. He was serious about his responsibility to the 5 packs. He was serious about fairness. He was serious about the land, about the old agreements between packs, about the weight of the decisions that came across his table. He was simply not serious about her. And that was the thing she could not quite put down, not because she needed him to think about her every moment, but because she was a person. A full, complete person with opinions and humor and small talents, and a sister she missed, and a mother who made extraordinary bread, and a whole interior life that nobody in this palace had ever once asked about. And she had been here 3 years. And nobody had asked. So she stood at walls at galas. She held glasses of sparkling water she did not drink. She watched rooms full of wolves doing the complicated, important work of pack politics, and she was present and appropriate and invisible, and she had decided, somewhere in the quiet of the East Corridor at 2 in the morning about a month before the Midsummer Summit, that she was getting very, very tired of it. She had not decided what to do about that yet. She was still deciding. But she was aware, in a new and steady way, that the decision was coming, that something was going to have to change. She was not sure yet what form the change would take, or how it would arrive. She had not yet imagined it would arrive in the form of a man from the Ironwood pack, who said her name correctly, and made her laugh and asked her to dance. But change, in her experience, never arrived in the form you imagined. It arrived in the form available. And she had said yes. The dance lasted 1 song. Darian was easy to dance with, the way he was easy to talk to, the way he was simply easy in that uncomplicated way that some people are. He led without being controlling. He talked without filling every silence. He laughed at the right moments and let the other moments be what they were, and Myra danced with him and felt, for the length of 1 song in a marble hall full of politics and old obligations, like a person standing in her own life rather than someone else's. The song ended. She thanked him. He said it was his pleasure and meant it. She stepped back from the dance floor. And then she looked across the hall and found, without looking for it, without knowing to look for it, the one pair of eyes that had been fixed on her for the last several minutes. Caius was looking at her. Not the casual glance of someone who happened to look in her direction. Not the polite, public attention of a king acknowledging a member of his household. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have just understood, and the understanding has not been comfortable. Fully, directly, with the kind of attention he typically reserved for things that required his complete focus. For exactly 2 seconds, across 20 meters and 200 wolves, their eyes met. She held it. She had spent 3 years not holding his gaze for too long, not pushing, not pressing. 3 years of measured, appropriate eye contact, the kind that communicated nothing and asked for nothing. For 2 seconds, she held his gaze and did not look away first. Then she turned, set her empty glass on a passing tray, and went to find somewhere to sit. She was not sure what she had seen in his face in those 2 seconds. She was not sure she had the energy, tonight, to figure it out. She found a chair near the far wall and sat in it and crossed her hands in her lap and looked at the room. And the room went on being the room, full of its important conversations and its careful alliances and its long, layered history, and she sat in the middle of it and thought about the bag she had started packing. Not tonight, it was simply there in the back of her mind the way it had been for several weeks now, present, waiting, the way a decision waits when you know you have made it but you have not yet said it out loud. She would not say it out loud tonight. Tonight she would sit here in this chair in this grand marble hall, with the sound of a new song beginning from the orchestra and the quiet, unexpected warmth of having danced still somewhere in her hands. Tonight that was enough. The gala wound down after midnight. Delegations said their goodbyes, cars were called. The Greystone contingent left loudly and cheerfully as they had arrived. Elda of the Ashford pack was escorted to her rooms by 2 of her wolves, moving slowly and deliberately, the way very old and very certain people move. Celia, the Coldwater proxy, left without speaking to anyone who was not essential to speak to, and Myra respected that quietly. Darian found her briefly before the Ironwood delegation left. He said it had been good to see her. She said the same. He said, without pressure, without implication, "I hope you are well, Myra, I mean that." And she believed him, and she said thank you, and he left. She was one of the last guests to move toward the exit. She was not in a hurry. Helena appeared at her elbow. "The king requests your presence in the blue room." Myra looked at her. Helena's face, as always, revealed nothing. "Now," Myra said. "When you are ready," Helena said, which was palace language for now. She followed Helena through the thinning crowd, through a side corridor she knew well, up a half-flight of stairs, and through a set of double doors into the blue room, which was what the palace called the small private sitting room off the main hall. It had a fireplace, and 4 chairs and tall bookshelves, and the particular quietness of a room that saw a great deal of important conversation. Caius was standing by the fireplace when she entered. He had his back to her, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, looking at the fire. Helena left, closing the doors. The fire crackled. Something in the room was different from usual. She could not name it immediately, some shift in atmosphere, some change in the air. She had been in rooms with Caius many times. She had a very good read by now of his baseline. This was not his baseline. "You wanted to see me," she said. He turned. And there it was again, that look, the one from across the hall. Closer now, and she could see it better from here. Something in his expression that was not composed. Something that was, for Caius Varon, almost unguarded. A small difference, subtle enough that anyone who did not know him well would miss it entirely. She knew him well enough to see it. She waited. He said her name, not the formal address. Her name, the short way, 2 syllables, said with a weight that was new. "Myra," he said, "who is Darian to you?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Someone who said hello." He was quiet, the fire shifted behind him. She watched his jaw work once, a small movement quickly controlled. "He danced with you?" "Yes," she said. "He asked and I said yes." Another silence, longer this time. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked the seconds with a very small, very precise sound. "I see," said Caius. And she stood in the blue room in the late quiet of the midsummer gala night and looked at the alpha king of 5 packs and understood that something had shifted tonight in a direction she could not yet read, and she was very tired, and she was not sure what to do with any of it. She said good night. She turned and walked to the door. She did not run, she also did not look back. But as she pulled the door closed behind her, she heard him say something, very quietly in the empty room, to no one in particular, to the fire perhaps, or to himself. She thought, though she was not certain, that he said, "I know." She did not stop. She walked down the corridor to the east wing, and up to her room, and she sat on the edge of her enormous bed and took off her silver clasp and set it on the nightstand and looked at her hands in the lamplight and thought about everything and nothing for a long time. And somewhere in the palace, in the blue room by the fire, the Alpha King stood alone. And something that had been sleeping in him for 3 years was very, very awake. Caius did not sleep. This was not, in itself, unusual. He was a man who had always slept lightly and risen early, who had trained himself from his early 20s to need no more than 5 hours on most nights, and to feel no worse for it. Grant had once said in the flat, honest way that Grant said most things, that Caius slept the way a wolf on watch slept, always half listening, never entirely at rest. Caius had not argued the point because it was accurate. But this was different. He stood at the window of his private study on the top floor of the north wing at 2 in the morning, looking out at the palace grounds. The lanterns still strung between the oak trees from the gala, most of them burned out now, leaving only a few amber points of light in the dark. His mind was not running through pack business or diplomatic strategy or the many things currently requiring his attention. His mind was doing something he almost never allowed it to do. It was replaying. The moment his glass stopped moving. The way she had looked across the hall, not at him, at Darian, at the man who had simply walked up to her and asked a simple question, and received in return the version of Myra that laughed easily and turned her face upward and occupied her own space as though she had every right to it. He had not seen that version of her in months. If he was honest with himself, and alone at 2 in the morning he was trying very hard to be honest with himself, he was not certain he had ever properly looked for it. The thought sat in him like a stone, not sharp exactly, more like heavy, the kind of thing you do not argue with because you already know it is true and arguing would just be noise. He turned from the window and sat in the chair behind his desk, not to work, just to sit. He put his hands flat on the surface of the desk. The oak was cool under his palms. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had for 7 years held the weight of 5 packs, who had made decisions with consequences he felt every day, who had spent his entire adult life building the kind of control that looked, from the outside, like certainty. He was certain about almost everything. He was not certain about this. The problem, and he saw it clearly now in the honest dark of 2 in the morning, was not that he did not know what Myra was to him. The problem was that he had known for some time and had chosen, very deliberately, not to look at it. It had started, if he could locate a beginning, about 8 months after she arrived. She had been in the library. He had come in to retrieve a specific volume from the reference section, a historical record of the border agreements between the Ironwood and Greystone packs, which he needed for a meeting the following morning. He had found her on the window seat of the 2nd floor with a book open in her lap, and her legs tucked under her and her hair loose, which he had not seen before, and she had been so deeply absorbed in whatever she was reading that she had not heard him come in, and he had stood at the bottom of the rolling ladder for a full 30 seconds watching her read. And then she had laughed, at the book, a small, quick, private laugh that she immediately muffled with her hand, as though embarrassed to have laughed at something when she was alone. He had retrieved his volume and left without speaking to her. But he had thought about it afterward, at the edges of his attention, where things lived before he decided to look at them properly. He had thought about it more than was appropriate. He had a great many things in his life that were more important than the sound of Myra laughing at a book she was reading alone. He had told himself this reliably for 2 years and 3 months. And here he was at 2 in the morning staring at his hands because a man named Darian had asked her to dance, and she had said yes, and the sound of her laughing on the dance floor, a fuller version of the library laugh, less guarded, more fully present, had walked through every wall he had built and sat down in the center of him and refused to leave. He stood up, sat down, stood up again. Grant appeared in the doorway. Grant always appeared when something was wrong. Caius did not know how he managed this, whether it was instinct or 20 years of close attention or simply the understanding between 2 people who had been through enough together to read each other without needing words. But Grant appeared in his dark robe, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face composed in the expression that meant he was not surprised and was not going to say so. "Sit down," Grant said. "I am standing." "I noticed, sit down anyway." Caius sat down. Grant came in and took the other chair, the one across the desk, and sat in it with the unhurried ease of a man who had sat in that chair in that room at that time of night more than once. He looked at Caius with the flat, calm attention that was his natural mode. "Tell me what is happening," Grant said. "Nothing is happening. You have been awake for 4 hours and you are not sitting still. Something is happening." Caius looked at the desk. Grant waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting. He had the patience of a man who understood that silence was simply the shape that honesty took before it was ready to speak. "She danced with Darian," Caius said. Grant said nothing for a moment, then Myra. "Yes, Darian, Beta of the Ironwood pack." "Yes, and this is the reason you are awake at 2 in the morning." Caius looked up at him. "It is affecting me in a way I find disproportionate." Grant's expression did not change. "Disproportionate." "Yes." The fire in the study had burned low. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its small, precise ticks. Somewhere outside, something moved in the trees. "I do not know what it means," Caius said. This was possibly the most honest thing he had said out loud in a very long time. Grant absorbed it, sat with it, did not immediately respond, which was one of the things Caius valued most in him. Then Grant said, You know what it means, you have known what it means. You have been not knowing it for about 2 years. Caius said nothing. She has been in your house for 3 years, Grant said. She has been present and appropriate and undemanding, and she has not once pushed past whatever wall you put up around her. She has given you every courtesy you have given her, which has not been a great deal, and she has not complained, and she has not made it complicated, and she has, as far as I have observed, done her best to build some kind of life within the considerable limitations of the position you have put her in. Caius said nothing. Tonight a man treated her like a person, asked her to dance, said her name like it mattered. And your instincts have apparently decided that tonight is the night they stop cooperating with your decision to hold her at a distance. The silence after this was long enough that the fire shifted again, sending a small rush of warmth across the room. That is a fair summary, Caius said finally. It is, Grant agreed. What are you going to do about it? Caius looked at the window. The dark outside, the few remaining gala lanterns, the line of the oak trees against the slightly lighter sky. I do not know, he said. For the second time tonight, for possibly the first time in years, he said, I do not know. Grant stood up. That is the first honest thing you have said in this room in a while. Thank you, Grant. I am going back to bed. You should do the same. I will. You will not, but it is good to say. He paused at the doorway. Caius. He looked up. Do not wait until she leaves, Grant said. Then he was gone. The room was very quiet. Do not wait until she leaves. Caius sat with that for a long time, in the dark and the quiet, with the clock ticking and the fire burning low and the trees moving gently outside the window, and something in his chest that had been held in one position for 3 years shifted, just slightly, like the first degree of movement in something that had been stuck. Not free, not yet. But moving. 3 floors below, in the East Wing's 3rd floor, Myra was not sleeping either. She was sitting on the window seat she had discovered in her first week at Crestholme, a deep nook in the bedroom wall, just wide enough to curl into, looking out over the inner courtyard with its fountain and its old stone walls. She had spent a great deal of time in this window seat over the years. It was the place where she felt most like herself, tucked into the wall, the palace around her but not pressing on her, the courtyard below quiet and small-scaled and manageable. She was thinking about Caius's face in the blue room. More specifically, she was thinking about his eyes when he had asked her who Darian was. The way they had looked, and she was very careful with herself here, very precise, the way they had looked was not like ordinary concern, or not only that. There had been something underneath the control, something that she had not seen before, something she could not yet name with confidence. She was also thinking about what he had said after she closed the door. I know. She was not sure what he knew, she was not sure she knew what she knew. She was not sure of very much at this particular moment in her life, which was itself a new development. She was usually sure of things, steady-footed, good at assessing. It was one of her more useful qualities. But she sat in the window seat at 2 in the morning and felt the edges of things blur slightly, and it was not entirely unpleasant, and that too was new. She thought about the bag in the cedar chest. The coin pouch, the letter to her sister still unsealed, still unfinished. The clothes without the palace insignia. She had been adding to it slowly, carefully over the last 6 weeks, not in a rush but with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of someone who had made a decision at a cellular level and was simply carrying it out. She had a plan. She would wait until the midsummer summit guests had departed and then she would go. Not forever, she had told herself. Or maybe forever, she had not decided. She had decided only that she needed to stop being invisible, and she could not stop being invisible here, not in this palace, not in this role, not beside a man who looked past her on good days and did not look at all on the rest. She had believed that 6 hours ago. She sat in the window seat and tried to believe it now. The thing about having a plan was that the plan existed in a kind of protected space, clean and logical, untouched by what actually happened in the world. You made the plan in the absence of the thing, and then the thing happened, and the plan and the thing had to share space, and they did not always fit together as neatly as you had hoped. She did not know what I know meant. She did not know what she had seen in his face. She leaned her head against the window glass and looked down at the fountain, which moved in the dark below with its gentle, persistent sound. Tomorrow, she thought, she would think about it tomorrow. She closed her eyes. The fountain ran. The palace breathed around her. Somewhere on the top floor of the north wing, a man was not sleeping either. Neither of them knew the other was awake. Neither of them knew that in 3 days, everything that had been held in careful, painful suspension between them would finally, irrevocably begin to fall. The morning after the gala, the palace was in its recovery mode. Myra recognized this state. She had lived through 6 major events at Crestholme and knew the particular quality of the morning after each one, the slightly slower pace, the cleared tables, the extra care taken to restore the grand rooms to their usual immaculate order. She came down to the kitchen at 7, made her tea, stood at the window. Helena appeared with a schedule for the day, 3 meetings she was not required to attend. A lunch in the second dining room with the Ashford delegation, who were staying 1 additional night before departing. She was required at this one, an afternoon with no formal obligations. The Ironwood pack departed at 6 this morning, Helena said, setting down a folder of correspondence. Myra nodded. She did not ask about Darian. She did not need to. She had not expected him to stay, had not imagined any particular future for 1 conversation and 1 dance. He had been kind to her. She hoped his journey home was easy. She thought about him exactly as much as the situation warranted, which was briefly and warmly and without complication, and then she put her attention back on her tea. What she was less successful at putting aside was Caius. She had not seen him yet this morning. He rose early and was usually already into his working day before most of the household was at breakfast, but his presence was detectable, the particular alertness in the staff's posture, the tray that had already gone up with his morning coffee, the lights visible in the north wing windows when she had crossed the inner courtyard an hour earlier. He was here, he was awake, and somewhere between last night and this morning, she needed to figure out how to inhabit the same building as him without the blue room conversation sitting between them like a piece of furniture someone had left in the middle of a hallway. She had done something she almost never did last night. She had held his gaze. She had answered his question plainly and without apology, someone who said hello, and she had not managed the moment the way she usually managed moments with him. She had been too tired, and underneath the tiredness something else, something that the dance had loosened in her. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea, and was honest with herself for a few minutes. She was uncertain about what she had seen in his face, not afraid in the way you are afraid of something dangerous, uncertain the way you are uncertain about something that could change things at a moment when you have already decided what the things are going to be. I know. What did he know? She stood up, washed her mug, set it on the drying rack. She was going to go to the lunch with the Ashford delegation. She was going to be pleasant and present. She was going to do the afternoon and the evening and the following morning 1 piece at a time. And she was going to figure out what she actually wanted. Not what was offered, not what was expected, not what was safest or most sensible. What she actually wanted. She went upstairs to get dressed. She passed the blue room on the way. The doors were closed. She did not stop, but she was aware of it as she passed that room, the fireplace and the 4 chairs and the particular quality of the silence in there last night. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has happened in a room, not visible anymore but still present somehow, the way the memory of heat stays in a stone fireplace long after the fire is out. She kept walking. The east wing opened before her, long and light-filled, and hers, as much as anything here was hers. She would figure it out. She always figured things out. She simply needed time and quiet and the particular kind of honesty she was best at, the kind that did not look away. The dance floor was still in her hands. That was the way Myra thought about it in the days after the gala, not as a memory exactly, more as a physical residue. The way movement sometimes stayed in the body after it was over, the way dancing left a warmth in the muscles that lasted longer than the dance itself. She felt it when she sat at the small desk in her room, writing a letter she would not finish. She felt it when she walked the garden path in the early morning. She felt it faint and persistent, like the echo of a note after the string has stopped vibrating. Something had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing in her external life had rearranged itself. She still rose early, she still made her tea, she still sat through the lunches and the brief obligatory appearances and the long, structured silences that made up the shape of her days here. The palace was the same palace. Helena was the same Helena. The east wing corridor still had its good afternoon light. But something underneath all of that had shifted, and she was precise enough with herself to know what it was. Darian had not done anything extraordinary. He had not changed her life in any obvious way. He had simply looked at her and talked to her and moved toward her in a room full of people, as though she were, obviously and without question, a person worth moving toward. That was all. It was so small that she was almost embarrassed by how much it meant. Almost. She was standing in the garden on the third morning after the gala, the early light flat and gold, her jacket pulled around her against the cool, when she let herself sit with the full weight of it. She was 25 years old. She had been in this palace for 3 years. She had arrived at 22 with her entire self intact, her curiosity and her humor and her opinions, and her way of seeing things that people who knew her well had always said was a little unusual, in a good way, in the way that meant she noticed things other people missed. And she had spent 3 years making herself smaller so that it would fit. Not because anyone had explicitly asked her to, nobody had told her to stop having opinions or stop being who she was, but she had learned, in the way you learn things in environments that are very quiet about their expectations, that the version of herself that took up space was not the version that fit here. The appropriate version was quieter, present without pressing. She had learned to perform the appropriate version until it felt almost natural, and then she had learned to stop noticing the difference between the performance and the thing itself. Darian had reminded her that there was a difference. That was what the dance had actually done, not opened a door toward him but opened a door back toward herself. She crouched down by the garden path and pulled a small, straggling weed from the edge of the bed, a thing she did sometimes when she was thinking. The gardeners had given up trying to tell her not to, having understood at some point that it was how she worked through things. She thought about the bag. She had opened the cedar chest the previous night after everyone was asleep and sat on the floor in front of it and looked at the bag for a while. The coin pouch, the unfinished letter to her sister Lena, with the 2 sentences she had managed to write and the rest of the page blank, the 3 sets of clothes, plain and practical and exactly the kind of thing you would wear if you were going somewhere on your own terms. She had not added anything to it. She had not removed anything either. She had just looked at it in the soft lamplight for a long time. What she was looking for, she understood now, was not the answer to whether to go. She had more or less made that decision. What she was looking for was the answer to why, specifically why. Not the general why that lived on the surface, but the real why underneath it, the honest one. Was she leaving because this life was wrong for her? Or was she leaving because she was afraid of what could be right? She stood up, brushed her hand on her jacket, and kept walking. Caius came to the garden at 8:30, which was not his habit. He usually spent his mornings in meetings or at his desk, or in the map room on the 2nd floor where he worked through the large, structural problems of pack governance. He very rarely came to the garden in the morning. She was not sure she had ever seen him in the garden in the morning. She heard his footsteps on the path behind her and recognized them. She knew the sound of everyone in this palace who moved through it regularly, by their pace and their weight and the particular rhythm of the way they walked, and his were unmistakable, deliberate, unhurried, like every step was chosen. She did not turn around. She kept walking, and he caught up with her in a few strides, and they were walking side by side along the central garden path before either of them said anything. This was strange because they did not walk together. They had not done this before. It was not a thing that happened. It was happening now. She waited. He walked. The garden was quiet around them, the birds doing their morning work, the fountain in the near distance making its consistent sound. He said, "I did not handle last night well." She kept walking. "All right. I mean the blue room." A pause. "I asked you something that was not the right question, and I did not give you any explanation for why I was asking." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the path ahead. "What was the right question?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I am not sure yet." She nodded slowly, looking back at the path. "But I want to know," he said. "When I have it, I want to ask it." This was, by far, the most personal thing he had ever said to her. She understood that. She held it carefully, turned it over, checked it for what it actually was rather than what she might want it to be. "All right," she said. They walked another few steps in silence. "You were laughing," he said. She looked at him. On the dance floor, he said, I have not seen you laugh in a long time. She thought about this, thought about being honest, made the decision in the space of one step. A while, she said. He absorbed that. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding something he did not know how to put down. That is my fault, he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too, a half step ahead of her, and turned. She looked at him, he looked at her. The garden was very still. It is not entirely your fault, she said carefully. I let it happen, I adjusted to it. I got very good at being here without being here. I know, he said. There was that again, I know. What do you know, she said. The question came out more direct than she intended, but she did not take it back. Something crossed his face. I know I have kept you at a distance, and I know that I told myself there were good reasons for it. He paused. I am less sure of the reasons this morning. She looked at him for a long moment. The light in the garden was still early, still flat and gold, and it was very quiet except for the birds and the fountain and the small sound of the world simply continuing to exist around them. She said, Why are you telling me this? Because last night, watching you on that floor with someone who was simply kind to you, simply easy with you, I understood something that I should have understood much earlier. He met her eyes, and his were very dark and very direct, and not at all the controlled, unreadable thing they usually were. I understood that I had been wasting something. The word landed between them. Wasting. She breathed slowly. The garden kept being the garden. I need you to understand something, she said. I am going to be honest with you right now because I am tired of being careful. He did not move. I have been invisible here, she said, not because I tried to be. Because I adjusted to being invisible because the alternative was pushing for something that was not being offered. And I do not push for things that are not offered. That is not who I am. She paused. But I am also not going to pretend that one conversation in the garden fixes 3 years. I know, he said, for the third time. And this time it sounded different, less like he was saying what he understood, more like he was saying what he deserved to hear. I do not know what you are offering, she said, or if you are offering anything I do not want to assume. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I am not sure yet either, but I am trying to find out. I wanted you to know I am trying. She looked at him. She had spent 3 years reading this man in the way you read someone you live alongside, but never truly know, in glimpses, in the gaps between his words, in the things he did not say. She was good at reading him. She was possibly better at reading him than anyone else in this palace. What she read now was not performance, was not political calculation, was a man who was standing in a garden at 8:30 in the morning in a conversation he had clearly started before he had fully decided what he was trying to say, which, for Caius Varan, was about as unguarded as it got. She thought about the bag. She thought about the coin pouch and the unfinished letter and the plain clothes. She thought about the dance and Darian's easy kindness and the way she had felt on the floor, like a person in her own life. She thought about all of it at once, briefly, the way you do when you are standing at a junction and you need to see all the roads at the same time before you choose. Then she said, I am not going to stop being honest, not anymore. If something concerns me, I am going to say it. If I need something, I am going to ask. I am done being the arrangement. Something moved in his face, something that was not the controlled version. Good, he said, I would prefer that. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and kept walking. He fell into step beside her again, and they walked the rest of the garden path in silence, but the silence was different from every silence they had shared before. It was not empty. It was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had, finally, started saying the things that mattered, and were taking a breath before continuing. She walked and thought about the cedar chest. She did not, tonight, add anything to the bag. She did not, tonight, take anything out of it. But she looked at it differently. And that was the beginning of something she had not let herself believe in for a very long time. The 5 days after the gala moved through Crestholme Palace with a strange, suspended quality, like the pause between a storm and the clearing sky. The visiting delegations departed one by one. Elda left on the second day, shaking Myra's hand at the entrance with both of hers and looking at her with sharp, knowing eyes and saying, Be well, child. The palace is only as large as you let it be. Myra had thought about that for a long time after the car drove away. By the fourth day, the palace had returned to its ordinary self. And in that ordinary self, something had altered. She noticed it in small things first. Caius appeared at the dinner table on the fourth evening, and he sat at the head and she sat at her usual place, and it was exactly as it had always been, except that he asked her what she had done that afternoon. She had looked at him, he had looked back. She said she had been in the library. He asked what she had been reading. It was a small question, simple, the kind of question anyone might ask. In 3 years he had never asked it. She told him about the book, an old natural history of the Northern Territories, dense with detail and a little slow in places but full of extraordinary drawings in the margins, the kind of book that someone had clearly loved very much before it ended up on a shelf in a palace library. She talked about it more than she intended to. He listened. He asked a question, she answered it, he asked another. It was simply a dinner where they talked, and she was present and so was he, and neither of them was performing. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought, so this is what it could be like. The thought was very quiet, very careful, not committed to anything yet, but present, real. On the fifth day she found him in the corridor outside the library and they walked in together without planning to, and he pulled the border agreement volume he had come for, and she went back to the natural history and they sat, him at the reading table, her on her window seat, and read in the same room for 90 minutes, not talking much, just existing in the same space without it being weighted or strange. She kept glancing at him over the top of her book. He kept reading. Once, without looking up from the page, he said, "There is something on the windowsill, behind you, to your left." She turned. A small bird, gray and brown, unremarkable, had landed on the exterior sill and was examining the glass with its head cocked. "Oh," she said. They both looked at it for a moment. Then the bird decided it had seen enough and left, and they both went back to reading, and neither of them commented on it, and the silence afterward was the most comfortable silence she had experienced in this palace in 3 years. She thought about the bag that night. For the first time, she thought about it with something that was not certainty. She did not open the cedar chest. She stood in the middle of her room instead, her arms at her sides, and said to no one, "What do you actually want?" The room did not answer. Her heart did though, quietly. Beneath the caution and the 3 years of careful management and the plan and the coin pouch and the unfinished letter to Lena, quietly underneath all of it, her heart said something small and honest and complicated. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not know yet if she was going to listen to it. But she heard it. That was new. Caius Varon had made many difficult decisions in his life. He had inherited the Alpha King's seat at 27, younger than any of his predecessors, at the end of a transition period that had been politically complicated and personally difficult. He had navigated it. He had made choices that cost him things he did not list, because listing them would not have changed them and would only have added weight to what was already heavy. He had built the authority he now held piece by piece, decision by decision, through 7 years of work that left very little room for anything that was not the work. He had always believed, with the steady and unexamined certainty of a man who has built his life on control, that the distance he maintained from the softer things was a choice, that he had chosen it, could unchoose it if necessary. He understood on the 5th day after the midsummer gala, sitting at the reading table in the library with Myra on the window seat and a small bird on the glass, that he had been wrong. It had not been a choice. Or it had been a choice in the way all things you do not examine are choices, made once and then maintained automatically, maintained until something disturbed the maintenance and made you look at it properly. He had looked at it. What he saw was this: he had kept her at a distance not because he was protecting his responsibilities or operating at the wise, cool remove that leadership required. He had kept her at a distance because the feeling frightened him. Not her specifically, the feeling. The thing that had been sitting under his daily life for 2 years and 3 months, filed in the quiet and not examined, that rose when she laughed at a book alone and thought no one was watching. The thing that his instincts had apparently understood much earlier than he had, and had simply waited, with the patience that instincts have, for him to catch up. He was frightened of needing something. He had not needed anything in a very long time. He had wanted things in the functional way, peace between packs, good governance, outcomes that justified the weight of the decisions that produced them. But wanting was different from needing. Wanting was something you had some distance from. Needing was something that lived inside you and could not be set aside. He had organized his entire adult life around not needing anything he could not provide himself. And then she had come to his palace at 22 with her quiet, steady presence and her way of seeing things and her laugh that she kept to herself in empty rooms. And something in him had looked at her that first week and known immediately, completely, and without caring about the complications. And he had spent 2 years and 3 months building walls between himself and the thing he had known. He had watched her on the dance floor, and the walls had come down in approximately 3 measures of a slow song. He was 40 pages into the border agreement document, and he had not retained any of it. He closed the document. He looked at her on the window seat. She was absorbed, her finger tracing a line of text, her lips moving slightly the way they did when she was reading something she found interesting. The bird was gone. The afternoon light had shifted. He said her name. She looked up. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "Not now, not here, but I want you to know it is coming." She looked at him for a moment, then, "I will be here." It was a simple thing to say, she said it simply, but it landed in him somewhere specific and he felt it, and he did not try to manage the feeling. He nodded. He went back to the border agreement. He did not retain any of it. Grant had been Caius's second for 6 years. Before that he had been his father's second, and before that he had been a man who ran border patrols in the Northern Territories and had shown extraordinary calm in a difficult winter and attracted the attention of the old king through sheer, unremarkable competence. He was not a calculating person. He did not maneuver or play the long game. He was simply honest, steadily, unvaryingly, sometimes inconveniently honest. He came to Caius's study on the 5th evening with a folder of documents and stayed 40 minutes after the documents were dealt with. "Grant," Caius said, "you are lingering." "I am," Grant agreed. "Anything specific?" "How is she?" Caius looked at him. "Myra," Grant said, "how is she?" "Better," Caius said, "then more precisely different." "Since the gala." "Different how?" He thought about it. "More present," he said finally. "She has been more herself, more willing to take up space." Grant said nothing, which was his way of asking a question. "I think she had been making herself smaller," Caius said. "I think she had been adjusting to what I gave her, and what I gave her was not enough." He paused. "Not remotely enough." "No," Grant agreed, without editorializing. "I told her I want to have an honest conversation with her." "Good." A pause. "When?" "I do not know yet. I need to know what I am saying before I say it." "That has always been your approach," Grant said. "Know everything before you speak. Have all the answers before you raise your hand." He set down his coffee. "I would suggest, respectfully, that this particular conversation is not one you can fully prepare for." Caius looked at him. "It is not a pact dispute or a treaty negotiation," Grant said. "You are not going to walk in with the position clearly defined and the counterarguments ready. You are going to walk in as a person who has not been honest, talking to a person who has every right to be skeptical. The only preparation that works in that situation is deciding to be honest regardless of the outcome." Caius was quiet. And Grant added, deciding that quickly, before she decides something else. "What does that mean?" Grant looked at him with the flat, patient attention that meant he was deciding how direct to be. He decided to be very direct. "She is not going to wait forever," he said. "I have watched Myra carefully for 3 years because she is someone worth watching, and she has been patient and she has been appropriate, and she has been a great deal more gracious about this situation than most people would have been. And I do not believe she is going to remain in a situation that continues to ask too much of her for too long." He let that sit. Caius sat with it. "How long?" he said. "I do not know, but the gala changed something in her. I saw it the next morning. She is standing differently." He paused. "If I had to guess, I would say she is in the process of making a decision." Caius stood up from his desk. He went to the window. The garden below was dark, the lanterns from the gala long gone, the oak trees dim shapes in the evening light. "Do not wait until she leaves." He had thought about that every day since Grant said it. "I will talk to her tomorrow," he said. "Good," said Grant. He turned from the window. Grant, is this recoverable, the distance I have kept, is that the kind of thing that can be undone? Grant looked at him for a long moment. Then he said with the kind of care that very honest people reserve for very important things, I do not know, that depends on her. But I know that if you do not try, you will have your answer whether you want it or not, and that answer will be worse than whatever happens if you try. He picked up his folder. Good night, Caius. He left. The study was very quiet. Outside, the garden was dark. Tomorrow, Caius thought. Tomorrow, he was going to have the conversation he should have had a very long time ago. Myra was finishing the natural history book. She sat in the east wing window seat at 9 in the evening, the lamp on the small table beside her throwing warm light across the page, the courtyard fountain audible below, and turned the last 30 pages of the book with the particular, slow attention she gave to things she was not ready to be finished with. The book was extraordinary in the way that very old books sometimes were, made by a person who had loved their subject so completely that the love was still detectable on the page, still present in the care of the illustrations, still alive in the specificity of the language. Someone had carried this book through years and places and had given it, at the end, to a palace library where it had sat on a shelf until she had pulled it down. She thought about things that lasted and things that did not, and then she thought about the bag in the cedar chest, which was where her thoughts had been circling for 5 days with the persistent, patient orbit of something waiting to be decided. She thought about the garden conversation, Caius saying, I am trying. She thought about the library and the bird on the glass, and the dinner where he had asked what she was reading. Small things. She was honest with herself about their smallness. 3 years of distance and 8 minutes in the formal sitting room and introduction after introduction as the companion, not the mate, not the queen, not anything with a name that mattered. Small things could not undo large things, she knew this, she was not naive. But she had spent 3 years also making herself smaller, and she had just in the last 5 days stopped. She was taking up her space again. She was laughing when she felt like laughing. She was speaking when she disagreed, quietly but actually. She was not managing herself down to fit the shape of what was expected. And he had not asked her to stop. He had in fact looked at her differently each time she did it, not in discomfort, in something that was, if she read it correctly, closer to relief. As though he had wanted this, as though some part of him had been waiting for her to be fully present and had simply not known how to ask. She turned the last page of the book, set it down, looked at the courtyard, said again to herself, what do you want? And this time the answer was a little less quiet, a little more willing to be heard. She wanted to stay. Not as the companion, not as the arrangement, not as the woman who stood by windows and held glasses she did not drink from and had her name said weightlessly by people who forgot it by morning. She wanted to stay as herself. She wanted him to see her fully, actually, in the way that she was beginning to think he was starting to try to see her. And she wanted to know whether trying was going to be enough. She would find out. She stood, set the book on the nightstand, turned off the lamp. She stood in the dark for a moment, in the quiet room, in the palace that had been her home for 3 years without ever quite feeling like it. She said, all right. Tomorrow she was going to find out. She was not going to make it easy. She was not going to pretend the 3 years had not happened. But she was going to find out. She got into bed and was asleep before the fountain below had counted many minutes. For the first time in a long time, she did not lie awake counting the reasons she should go. He came to her door. Not through Helena, not through a message delivered by one of the household staff, not with the formal request for a meeting that was his usual method of scheduling time with her. He came himself in the early evening after his last meeting of the day to the East Wing's 3rd floor and knocked on her door with 2 quiet knocks and stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and waited. She had heard him coming. She always heard him, the weight of his steps, the particular deliberate quality of how he moved. She had been sitting at her small desk with the finished natural history book and a cup of cooling tea, and she had heard him in the corridor and gone still, and then she had heard the 2 quiet knocks and stood up. She opened the door. He was there. No staff, no folder of documents, no scheduled agenda. Just him in the corridor looking at her with the expression she had been seeing with increasing frequency in the last 5 days, unguarded in the particular way that things are unguarded when they have run out of the energy required to stay guarded. I said I would come when I knew what I wanted to say, he said. She waited. I do not know all of it yet, he said, but I know enough. May I come in? She stepped back from the door. He came in. She left the door open behind him. This seemed important, both practically and in terms of what it communicated, and he did not comment on it. He stood in the center of her room, which was the first time he had been in her room, and he looked at the window seat with its view of the courtyard, and the small desk, and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and the finished book on the nightstand, and then he looked at her. I have kept you at arm's length, he said. Since you came here, 3 years, I told myself there were reasons. I told myself the time was not right, or the situation was not clear, or that it was better for you even to not be pulled into something I could not define. I believed those reasons. I believed them enough that I did not look at them very carefully. She said nothing. She stood near the window, her arms at her sides, watching him. I looked at them after the gala, he said. I looked at them at 2 in the morning, which is when I tend to look at things I have been avoiding, and what I found was that they were not good reasons. They were true things, some of them about complexity and timing and the difficulty of this position, but they were not the real reason. He paused. The real reason was that I was afraid. She stayed quiet. Not of you, he said. Not of you specifically. Of needing something. Of having something I could lose. I have built my entire working life around not having things I could lose because this role takes from you, and I had decided at some point that the only things I was willing to have taken were things I could afford to lose. He stopped. The room was very still. She said, and then I watched you dance, he said, with a man who was simply easy with you, simply kind, and I understood that I had made a significant error. Something moved in her chest. She held it carefully. I understood, he continued, that I had been holding you at a distance in order to protect myself from needing you, and that it had not worked. Because the thing I was protecting myself from had already happened, somewhere in the last 2 years without my permission, and all I had succeeded in doing was making you invisible in your own life while I maintained the distance. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that was a very honest thing to say. I am trying, he said. She moved away from the window. She came to stand closer, not very close, but closer, the distance between them now the length of a room rather than the length of a palace. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. I have a bag packed. He went still. In the cedar chest, she said, and she watched him look at the chest and then look back at her. I have been adding to it for 6 weeks. A coin pouch, some clothes, a letter to my sister that I have not been able to finish. She let that sit. I was planning to leave after the Midsummer Summit. He was very quiet. I am not saying this to be threatening, she said. I am saying it because you just told me the truth and I think I owe you the same. I was going to go because I could not keep being invisible. Because I was disappearing here slowly, and I could feel it happening and I could not find a way to stop it. Mayra, he said. It came out low, and there was something in it she had never heard in his voice before. Let me finish, she said. He stopped. I have not left, she said. I have not added anything to the bag in 5 days, and tonight before you knocked I was sitting at that desk and I was thinking about what I actually want. Not what is offered, not what is practical, not what fits the situation, what I actually want. She looked at him directly. And I want to stay, but not as the companion, not as the arrangement, not as the person who stands by walls at your galas and gets introduced as part of the furniture. He said nothing. He was looking at her with an intensity that had no performance in it. If you are offering something real, she said, I need it to actually be real, not a better version of what has been happening, something different, something where I am a person in this house and not a position. The room held its breath. He said, yes. Just that, yes. One word, she said. It is all I have right now, he said, but I mean it completely. He moved toward her 1 step and stopped as though checking whether she wanted him to. I cannot undo 3 years, I know that. I am not asking you to pretend they did not happen or to believe that one conversation changes them. I am asking you to let me show you what I mean, what I am offering. Let me make it real instead of asking you to take my word for it. She looked at him. He was 2 steps away. The lamplight in the room was warm and the courtyard was quiet below, and the cedar chest sat at the foot of her bed, and inside it was the bag she had been packing and the unfinished letter to her sister. She thought about what Elda had said, the palace is only as large as you let it be. She thought about the dance, and the garden and the library and the bird on the glass. She thought about 3 years. She thought about what came next. She said, you have to actually try, not palace formal trying, actually trying, saying my name like it matters, asking what I think, letting me be all of me, not the appropriate version. Yes, he said. And I am not going to pretend everything is fine when it is not. I am not going back to being managed. I do not want you to. She looked at him for one more long, careful moment. Then she said, all right. Something in his face changed. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time released by 1 degree, and she saw it, and it was the face of a man who had been carrying something enormous and had just been told, for the first time, that he did not have to carry it entirely alone. She moved to the cedar chest. She opened it. She looked at the bag for a moment. She did not unpack it. She did not add to it. She simply closed the chest again and looked at him and said, you should probably start tonight. He looked at her. Trying, she said. You should probably start tonight. He nodded. He sat on the window seat. She sat in the chair by the desk. And they talked, actually talked, for the first time as themselves, without the management and without the distance and without the protocol. And the courtyard fountain ran below, and the lamp made its warm circle of light, and somewhere in the cedar chest a bag sat half-packed and a letter to sister sat unfinished, and the palace breathed around them and the night came in through the window glass, and they were, for the first time in 3 years, 2 people in a room with nothing deliberate between them. It was not an ending. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning, and beginnings are always a little uncertain, a little unsteady, like the first steps after a long time sitting still. But it was real. And Myra, who had spent 3 years learning to live without real things, held on to it with both hands. The first thing that changed was the mornings. Myra noticed it on the 3rd morning after the conversation in her room. She came down to the kitchen at 7, as she always did, and found that someone had already made coffee. Not tea. Coffee, which was her preference on mornings when she needed to wake up properly rather than wake up slowly, and which she almost never mentioned because it seemed too small a thing to mention. She stood at the counter and looked at the coffee pot. Helena came in behind her, with the morning correspondence tucked under her arm. He asked me last week, Helena said, setting the correspondence on the table, what you preferred in the mornings. Myra looked at her. I told him, Helena said simply, and left it there, and went to the sink to fill the kettle, and that was that. Myra poured her coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and held the mug in both hands and thought about this small, specific thing. A man who had 7 years of pack governance on his desk, asking his household manager what kind of morning drink a woman in his East Wing preferred, and she felt something that she was not yet ready to call what it was. She called it notable. The mornings continued to be notable. On the 4th morning, he was in the kitchen himself when she came down, which had happened perhaps twice in 3 years and never at 7 o'clock. He was reading something, standing at the counter with a cup of his own coffee, and he looked up when she came in and said good morning in a way that was different from how he had been saying good morning. Not significantly different, not dramatically, but different in the way that small things are different when the person saying them actually means it. She said good morning back. They drank their coffee in the same room. It was quiet and ordinary, and she could feel her own heart behaving in a way she was slightly annoyed by. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to become someone who got quietly emotional over shared morning coffee. She had been reasonable and grounded and clear-eyed for 3 years, and she was going to stay that way. She drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window and was quiet and grounded. Her heart continued behaving the way it was behaving. She chose to address it later. Grant noticed the change too, because Grant noticed everything, and because he had been watching this particular situation with the focused attention of a man who was invested in the outcome. He did not say anything to Caius about it. He had said what he needed to say, and Caius had listened and acted, and that was how it was supposed to work, and commenting on the results would have been both unnecessary and slightly smug. He allowed himself, privately, one small moment of satisfaction. Then he went back to work. The official functions continued. That was the nature of the Alpha King's household. Events did not pause for personal recalibrations. Schedules did not adjust for conversations that changed things. The machinery of pack governance moved forward on its own schedule without reference to what was happening in the East Wing's third floor. There was a dinner with the Northern Pack representatives on the 9th day after the gala. Myra attended, as required, in a deep green dress that Helena had selected and that Myra had agreed to with less resistance than usual because it was, she admitted to herself, a good dress. She was introduced, as always, as the king's companion. And then Caius, who was standing beside her when the Greystone representative made the introduction, said, "Myra is part of my household." It was a small difference in wording. It was an enormous difference in meaning. The Greystone representative adjusted and moved on, and the moment passed in about 4 seconds. But Myra had heard it. And across the table 3 minutes later, when the conversation had moved on to other things, she looked at Caius. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, a beat longer than she usually did, and then looked back at her plate, and she was not smiling exactly, but she was close to it. Part of my household. Not companion, not representative, not the careful, distancing language that had placed her precisely nowhere for 3 years. Part of my household was a different sentence. It implied belonging. It implied a stake. It was not everything she had asked for, and she was under no illusion that one dinner table moment was a transformation. But it was different. And different, she was learning, accumulated. Different added to different added to different was eventually change. She called her sister Lena on the 12th day. This was not unusual. She called Lena every other week, short calls that covered family news and the bakery and whatever was happening at home. Lena was 20, quiet and perceptive in the way that very youngest siblings often are, having spent their childhood watching everyone else before getting their own turn. "You sound different," Lena said. Myra was in the garden, her phone warm in her hand, the morning light coming through the oak trees at an angle that made the whole thing look unreasonably lovely. "I am fine," Myra said. "I did not say you sounded bad," Lena said. "I said different. You sound lighter. What is happening?" "Nothing is happening." "Myra." She sighed. "Something small might be happening. I am not sure yet." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "Is it him?" Myra looked at the oak trees. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "You sound like you know." "I sound like I am paying attention," Myra said. "That is different from knowing." "Okay," Lena said, in the voice that meant she was letting it go but filing it. "Are you happy, or closer to happy?" Myra thought about the coffee, the garden conversation, the library, part of my household, the long talk in her room, 2 people simply being honest, the window open to the courtyard below. "Closer," she said. Lena said, "Good." And she meant it, and Myra heard that she meant it, and something loosened slightly that she had not known was tight. They talked for 20 minutes about bread and home and the things that were constant, and after she hung up, Myra stood in the garden for a while with the phone in her hand and the morning around her, and she thought about the unfinished letter to Lena in the cedar chest, and she thought, "I do not think I am going to need to finish it. Not yet, maybe not at all." 3 weeks after the Midsummer Gala, the Ironwood Pack sent a formal invitation. It arrived through official channels, requesting the presence of King Caius and members of his household at a harvest celebration at Ironwood territory in 6 weeks' time. It was signed by the Ironwood Alpha. It also included a personal note, handwritten, addressed to Myra. She found it with the official invitation when Helena brought the morning correspondence. She set the formal letter aside and unfolded the handwritten note. It was brief, 3 sentences from Darian. He hoped the summer was treating her well. The soup from the roadside place had been equally good on the return journey. He hoped she would be able to attend the harvest celebration. She read it twice. It was kind, genuinely kind in the uncomplicated way Darian was kind. There was nothing in it that required concern or interpretation. It was a note from a person who had enjoyed a conversation and a dance and was simply staying in touch. She was aware, however, of the fact that it existed. She was also aware that Caius would know the invitation had arrived. He saw all formal correspondence, and that he would know a personal note had come with it. She thought about what to do with this information. She was not a person who managed conversations or manufactured situations. She had spent 3 years being excessively managed and had no appetite for bringing that particular quality into her own behavior. So she simply carried the note with her to the library that afternoon, where Caius had taken to occasionally appearing in the late afternoon with his own work, and she set it on the table beside him without preamble. "Darian sent a personal note with the Ironwood invitation," she said. He looked at the note, did not pick it up. "I know," he said. She sat in her window seat. "I am not going to pretend it did not arrive. I thought you should know I am aware of it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What does it say?" "That he hopes the summer is going well, and that the soup on the way home was still good." Something moved on his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "The soup." "From a roadside place," she said. "He mentioned it the night we talked. He seemed very sincere about the soup." "I am sure he did." He looked at the note again briefly. "He is a good man." She looked at him. "I mean that," he said. "I am not saying it as a performance. He is a good man, and he was kind to you, and I am aware that the kindness he showed you in about 40 minutes was more than I managed in 3 years." She held that. "I am going to keep working on that disparity," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you going to write back to him?" She thought about it honestly, a brief note, thanking him for the invitation, being polite. He nodded. "That seems right. You are not going to make this strange." He looked at her directly. "I am trying, very deliberately, not to make anything strange. That is actually a significant portion of my effort at the moment." She picked up her book. She did not entirely succeed in reading it. On the 31st night after the Midsummer Gala, she finished the letter to her sister. She sat at the small desk in her room in the late evening, with the lamp on and the courtyard quiet below, and she took the old letter out of the cedar chest and unfolded it and looked at the 2 sentences she had written and the rest of the blank page. She did not write the version she had been trying to write for 6 weeks. She did not write the version that explained why she was leaving. She wrote instead a different version, shorter, simpler, honest in a different way. She wrote, "Lena, I think I am staying. I think this place might actually be becoming mine. I will call you on Thursday and explain properly. Do not tell Mum yet because I am not entirely sure, but I am closer to sure than I have been. I think I am going to be all right here." She sealed it. She set it on the desk. She opened the cedar chest and looked at the bag. The coin pouch, the clothes, the original unsent letter now replaced. She looked at the bag for a long time. Then she took the clothes out and put them back in the wardrobe, where they belonged. She left the coin pouch where it was. Old habits, she thought, old habits were allowed. She closed the chest. She sat on the edge of the bed in the warm lamplight and listened to the courtyard fountain and the sounds of the palace, and thought about what it meant to decide to stay. Not to stay because leaving was too hard, not to stay because you had run out of reasons to go, but to stay because the thing you were staying for was worth staying for. She thought it was. She was going to find out. The letter to Lena sat on her desk for 2 days before she sent it. She looked at it every morning and every evening, not because she was changing her mind, but because she was being careful with herself in the particular way she had learned to be careful, checking and rechecking, making sure the decision was real, and not a thing she had talked herself into at 11 at night in the lamplight. It held. Every morning she looked at it and it was still true. Every evening it was still true. On the 3rd morning she put it in an envelope, wrote the address, and gave it to Helena to send, and that was that. It was out of her hands and on its way, and she stood in the corridor after and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not certainty. Something more active than that word, more like the feeling of having stepped off a fence you have been balancing on for too long. You were not certain of the ground, but you had committed to it, and that commitment was itself a kind of relief. She went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table with it, and looked at the garden through the window and let herself exist, for a few minutes, without thinking about anything in particular. Caius came down at 7:15, which was later than usual. He looked, she noticed, as though he had slept adequately for perhaps the first time in weeks. There was something less held in him, still himself, still the particular composed quality that was simply how he was built, but under it something that was, by his standards, relaxed. You sent the letter, he said. She looked at him. How do you know? Helena mentioned the outgoing post. He paused. She did not read it, she just noted it. She mentions things she thinks I should know. Myra considered this. Helena is very observant. She is the most observant person in this building, he agreed, possibly in the territory. He poured his coffee. She watched him. It was a letter to my sister, she said. I know. I told her I am staying. He stopped moving for a moment. Just a fraction of a second, the coffee cup paused in his hand. Then he set it down and looked at her. Good, he said. It was the same word he had used before in other contexts, and it still sounded in his voice like something larger than its 4 letters. I am not unpacking the bag entirely, she said. The coin pouch is still in there. He nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Old habits, she said. Yes, a pause. I have old habits too. Some of them are not useful. She looked at him. Such as? He sat down across from her, which was still a new thing, something he had started doing in the last week, sitting down in rooms rather than remaining in motion, as though he was practicing the act of simply being somewhere without needing to be moving toward the next thing. Such as deciding things alone, he said. Pack matters, household matters, I take them in and process them and decide and then announce the decision. I have always done it this way. It is efficient. But, she said, but I think I have been doing it with everything, as a default, including things that are not pack matters. He looked at his coffee. I made the decision to keep you at arm's length alone. I maintained it alone. I tried to end it alone, which is how it took until you had a half-packed bag before I managed to say anything useful. She was quiet. I am trying to change that, he said. She thought about what this cost him to say. A man who had spent 7 years being the deciding person, the final word, the one who carried the weight and the outcome. Saying, I decided things alone and some of those things were wrong and I am trying to change the pattern. That was not a small thing to say. It was a significant thing and she heard it as significant. All right, she said. He looked at her. That is all. That is all, she said. I am not going to make this harder than it needs to be. You told me something true. I heard it. We move forward. You are very practical about this. I have been impractical about this for 3 years, she said, taking it personally when I could have just been honest. I am done being impractical. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was still learning to read, something that was not admiration exactly but was close to it. Something that said, you are more than I gave you room to be and I am aware of that and I am not going to forget it. She drank her tea. He drank his coffee. The kitchen was ordinary and warm, and the morning came through the window in its good, flat, early way, and they sat in it together. 6 weeks after the gala, they traveled to the Ironwood harvest celebration. It was the first time Myra had left the palace grounds in 5 months, and she was aware of this as the car moved through the Crestholme gates and onto the northern road with the morning behind them and the Ironwood territory ahead. She sat in the back seat with the window lowered slightly, the late summer air coming in warm and scented with pine and grass, and something she identified after a moment as simply, outside, the uncomplicated smell of being somewhere that was not the palace. She breathed it in. Caius was beside her. He had his documents on his knee. He was always working. She had understood this about him long ago and she did not take it personally now. But he was also, she noticed, not entirely in the documents. He looked up every few minutes, sometimes at the road ahead, sometimes at the trees, once briefly at her. You look like you are breathing, he said. She turned. I am always breathing. Differently, he said. You are breathing like someone who has been inside for a long time. She smiled. I have been inside for a long time. We should fix that. I can fix that myself, she said. I can leave the grounds whenever I want to. I know, he said, but we should fix it together. She looked at him. He had gone back to his documents. She turned back to the window and the road and the trees and let the air come in and thought about what it meant to fix things together. And it was a thought she could not quite get to the end of, because it opened onto something large that she was still learning the dimensions of. She let it stay open. The road went north. The Ironwood territory, when they reached it, was everything she had been told it was, dense and old and full of trees so large that the light came through in specific, intentional shafts, as though the forest itself had opinions about beauty. The harvest celebration was held at the Ironwood Pack's Great Hall, which was not marble and chandelier like Crestholme but timber and lantern, and completely different in a way that made her realize, suddenly, how much one kind of beautiful you could spend 3 years inside without noticing the others. Darian was among the first faces she saw when they arrived. He crossed to them both with an open, easy expression. He greeted Caius with the formal acknowledgement of a beta to an alpha king, respectful and practiced. Then he turned to Myra. "Myra," he said, "you look settled." She thought about what that meant coming from him. "I think I am," she said. He smiled. It was the same smile from the gala, genuinely warm, genuinely uncomplicated. He was glad she was there. He was glad she was well. There was nothing else in it. "The soup was good on the way home too," she said. He laughed. "I told you." They talked for a few minutes, the three of them, naturally and without any difficulty, and then the Ironwood Alpha arrived and the evening opened into its celebration. Myra moved through it differently than she moved through Crestholme events. She talked to people she had not met before. She asked questions she was actually curious about. She laughed more than once, the real laugh, the one that arrived before she decided to let it. At one point, she looked across the hall and found Caius watching her from where he stood with the Ironwood Alpha. He was not watching the way he had watched at the gala. He was watching simply. The way you watch something you are glad is there. She looked back at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the conversation she was having. But she was smiling. They drove home the following morning. The road south through the ironwood trees, then the open country, then the familiar approach to Crestholme. She had her own window open again. The air was cooler now, autumn moving in at the edges of the summer, and the quality of light had shifted the way it did in this season, lower, more amber, the shadows longer. She was thinking about what Darian had said. Settled. Was she settled? She turned the word over. It was not the same as happy, or it was not only that. Settled was more specific. Settled meant something about where you were, about the ground under your feet. She had been standing on ground that did not feel like hers for a long time. She thought it might be starting to feel like hers. That was new. And new, she thought, was what she had been asking for. The car passed through the Crestholme gates. The palace rose ahead of them, large and old and full of corridors she had learned, and rooms she had made her own, and a cedar chest with a coin pouch in it, and a library with a window seat, and a kitchen where someone had been making coffee for her every morning for almost 4 weeks. She looked at it. For the first time in a long time she looked at Crestholme and thought, home. Not perfectly, not without reservation. Not with the uncomplicated certainty that she had felt about the Fenmark bakery and her mother's kitchen and the small house where she grew up, but in the specific, particular way that a chosen place becomes a home, gradually, and then all at once, when you finally let it. She let it. The pack business that came in September was the most complicated of the year. A territorial boundary dispute between the Greystone Pack and the Coldwater Pack, an old disagreement, dormant for 12 years and now returned in the form of an incident at the shared border that had not resulted in injuries, but had come close enough to make both alphas concerned and both packs tense. It came to Caius for mediation, which was his role under the compact that governed all 5 packs, and it was the kind of dispute that required every skill he had: knowledge of the history, patience with the people, the ability to hold firm under pressure from both sides simultaneously. He worked it for 10 days. During those 10 days he was largely occupied, long hours in the map room, meetings with both alphas separately and then together, a 2-day trip to the shared border to walk it himself and see the incident site and speak with the wolves who had been present. Grant ran beside him through all of it, steady and precise. The household adjusted to the reduced availability with the practiced ease of a household that had done this before. Myra adjusted too. She was not concerned exactly. She understood what this was, pack business, serious and demanding, the work that was the actual content of his life and his responsibility. She did not take it personally. She understood the shape of it. But she noticed his absence in the kitchen. She noticed the evenings without conversation. She noticed the map room light on at midnight when she walked the corridor past it, not lingering, just aware. She left things at his door. Not dramatically, not with notes or statements. Simply practical things, the coffee that she made in the mornings and occasionally set on the tray outside the map room when she knew Helena was occupied elsewhere. A book from the library that she had found and thought might interest him, not a political text, something about the history of the northern forests, the kind of book you read when your mind needs to be somewhere other than the problem it has been inside for 8 hours. Small things, quietly delivered, without requiring anything in return. On the 7th day, she came back from a morning walk to find a note on her desk. 3 lines, his handwriting, which she had seen on official documents but never on something personal, angular and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write as a discipline rather than an expression. It said, "The book was very good. Thank you for thinking of me. I will be at dinner tonight." She read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of the desk, next to the finished letter to Lena, and went to get her jacket. He was at dinner. He was quieter than usual. The dispute was not yet resolved, but he was present. He asked about her morning walk. She told him about the North Garden, where something interesting was happening with the late-season roses, a variety she had not noticed before. He listened. He told her 2 things about the boundary situation, not enough to detail the politics, but enough to let her understand where his mind was. She did not ask for more than he offered. She also did not offer less than she had. That she was learning was the particular balance of this thing they were building, not giving less than you had, not asking for more than was offered. Moving toward each other at the pace that was actually real. After dinner, he said he needed to get back to the map room. She said, "I know, go." He paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for the book and for the other mornings." She met his eyes. "You would have done it for me." He considered this. "I should have been doing it for you already." "You are now," she said, "that is enough." He looked at her for a moment in the doorway. Then he said her name, just her name, nothing else, the short, clear 2 syllables, as though the name itself was the thing he wanted to say. She held it. He left. She sat at the dinner table in the quiet house and listened to the sounds of the palace and felt, in a way she had not felt in a very long time, like someone who was both fully where they were and fully themselves. Both at once. That, she thought, was what she had been looking for. The boundary dispute was resolved on the 10th day. Caius came down to the kitchen on the morning of the 11th day at 7 o'clock, and he looked different, not dramatically altered, but the specific tightness that had been in him for 10 days was gone, and what was underneath it was the person she had been getting to know, serious but with some space around the seriousness now, room to breathe. He poured his coffee. She was already at the table with her tea. He sat down. "It is done," she said. "It is done." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "The terms are documented, both packs have signed. They are still frustrated with each other, which will probably last for the better part of a year, but they are not going to act on it." He paused. "Grant thinks they might actually become allies in 5 years. He said it very calmly, as though it were not a surprising prediction at all. "Grant is usually right," she said. "He is," Caius agreed. "It is occasionally difficult." She smiled. He looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "I want to show you the north boundary when the situation quiets down. The forest up there is remarkable, nothing like the ironwood but different in its own way." He stopped. "I thought you might find it interesting. Since you have been reading about the northern forests." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the expression she had learned the dimensions of now, the one that was his unguarded version of himself, not performing warmth, not calculating the appropriate level of openness. Simply himself looking at her, wanting to share something. "I would like that," she said. "In a few weeks," he said, "when the autumn color is at its peak, it is." He paused, searching for the word. He was not typically a man who searched for words. "It is extraordinary," he said, "the kind of thing that makes you feel small in the right way." She thought about that, the right way. "Yes," she said, "I would like to see it." He nodded. They drank their coffee and tea. The kitchen was ordinary and warm. Outside the window, the garden was turning, the late summer giving way to autumn, the edges of things going amber and gold, the whole world doing the seasonal thing it did, releasing one version of itself in order to become the next. She watched it through the glass and thought that this was the thing about change. It was always already happening, underneath the surface, in the roots of things, before you could see it. By the time you saw the color in the leaves, the decision had already been made. October came to Crestholme with cold air and good light. The palace in autumn was different from the palace in summer. The colors outside the window, the particular quality of the mornings, the way the indoor spaces became warmer simply by contrast. She had lived through 2 previous autumns here and had noticed these things in the detached way she had noticed most things. Abstractly, at a remove, the way you notice the qualities of a room you are staying in temporarily. This autumn she noticed them differently. She noticed the way the oak trees in the garden went from green to gold to a deep amber that caught the afternoon light and held it. She noticed the roses in the north garden, the variety she had told Caius about, opening for a second time in the cool, with blooms that were smaller than their summer versions but more intensely colored, as though the cold had concentrated something in them. She noticed all of it with the full, present attention of someone who was in a place, not just occupying it. She was in it. That was what had changed. She was in it the way you are in the places that belong to you, with the complete attention of someone who knows they are staying. The letter from Lena arrived on the 1st of October. 4 pages, which was unusual for Lena, who tended toward economy. She had apparently decided that if Myra was staying, then she deserved a proper reply. She wrote about the bakery and their mother and the new person their eldest brother had started seeing, and the particular way the autumn was hitting the Fenmark territory this year. Good colors, Lena said, better than last year. And then, at the bottom of the 4th page, 2 lines. I am glad you are staying. I have been worried about you for a while. Do not tell Mum I said that, but I have been. You sounded like yourself again when you called. Hold on to that. Myra read those 2 lines 3 times. Then she went and found Caius. He was in the map room with Grant, reviewing something that she did not interrupt, but she waited in the corridor until Grant came out, and Grant looked at her and said, 10 minutes, and went to get coffee. She knocked. He said, come in. She came in. He looked up from the table. He had ink on 2 of his fingers, actual ink from a real pen which he still used for certain things. He looked at her, and whatever was on her face was apparently readable, because he set the pen down. What is it? He said. Nothing bad, she said quickly. Letter from Lena. And she says I sound like myself again. She paused. She says she has been worried about me for a while. He was quiet. I am telling you because I think I was not for a long time like myself. I think I had drifted quite far from it, and I kept telling myself I was fine, I was adjusting, it was practical, it made sense. But she noticed. From a phone call every other week she noticed. He came around the table. She had not expected him to move. He was a person who stood at things, tables, windows, fireplaces. He moved toward her and stopped close, closer than usual but not so close as to demand anything, and he looked at her directly. I know, he said, for the last time, for the most important time. She looked back at him. You are, he said, like yourself now. Very much. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been calling notable and observing and checking and rechecking for the better part of 2 months, and had not yet allowed herself to name. She named it now. She was not going to say it out loud, not yet. It was too new and too large, and she was still careful with herself, always, about the difference between what was real and what she wanted to be real. But she named it. And naming it was the thing you did when you were no longer afraid of what it was. She said, I am going to go read in the library. All right, he said. You have work. I do. She turned toward the door. Myra, he said. She turned. This evening, he said, after dinner, I wanted to show you something in the garden. If you are willing. She looked at him. The roses, he said, the second bloom, I thought you would want to see them properly, in the evening light. She said yes. She went to the library. She tried to read. She could not concentrate on any of it. She sat in the window seat with the book open on her lap and looked at the oak trees outside, which were at their most amber now, at the peak of their autumn color, and she thought about the name she had finally given to the thing in her chest, and she thought about what it meant to name something you have been circling for months. It meant you were no longer afraid of it. That was new too. She looked at the oak trees and let the feeling exist without trying to manage it or reduce it or translate it into something smaller than it actually was. She let it be as large as it was. That was, she was learning, the only way to hold something real. She sat in the library until the light changed. Then she went to get ready for dinner. She wore a dark red top that she liked because it was exactly the right temperature for an October evening, and because it was hers, chosen by her, for no reason other than that she liked the color. Not managed, not performed. Just herself. Dinner was quiet, just the two of them, as it increasingly was. Helena had set the table simply and left them to it, which was also increasingly how things went, the household learning the new shape of things and adjusting to it without being asked, the way good households do. They talked about the North Forest, which he was still planning to show her. They talked about a letter he had received from the Ashfin Pack's new representative, a young man who had taken over some of Elda's administrative responsibilities and who was, Caius said, going to be very good at it in about 3 years and was right now still learning what very good meant. She talked about the book she had not been able to read. He did not ask why she had not been able to read it, and she did not explain. Some things were allowed to be private. Some things were simply yours to carry quietly, even when they were good things. After dinner, he said, "The garden." She stood up. They went together. The North Garden in October at dusk was exactly what he had said it would be. She stood in it and understood why he had thought of her when he saw it. The second bloom roses, small and intensely dark, the color of something deep, were open in the low, angled light of the evening, and the whole garden had the quality of things that know their season is ending and have decided to be entirely themselves because of it, rather than in spite of it. He stood beside her. They looked at the roses. She was not going to make a speech. She had spent 3 years in this palace learning that some things were better left as themselves, not managed, not explained, not resolved into something neater than they actually were. She reached out and touched one of the small blooms. The petals were cool and firm. "Elda told me," she said, "that the palace is only as large as you let it be." He was quiet beside her. "I let it be very large," she said. "For a long time I made it enormous. I made myself small inside it." "I know," he said. "I am done doing that," she said. "I know that too," he said. She turned and looked at him in the evening light, this man who had been a stranger and an absence and now, slowly and imperfectly, and with genuine effort, was becoming something she did not yet have the word for. "I am going to need you to keep trying," she said. "Not perfectly, I am not asking for perfect, but consistently." "I will," he said. She believed him. She looked back at the roses. "They are extraordinary," she said. "Yes," he said, but he was looking at her when he said it. She let it be what it was. The garden held them both in the dusk, the roses their intense second bloom color, the fountain somewhere behind them still running, the palace at their backs with all its rooms and all its corridors and all its years of stone and quiet. The bag was in the cedar chest with the coin pouch. The letter to Lena had been answered. The morning coffee was a standing thing. The library was hers, the kitchen was hers, the window seat with the courtyard view was hers. The North Garden at dusk was hers. She breathed in the cool air and the smell of the roses and the autumn, and let all of it be exactly as large as it actually was. No smaller. She was done making herself smaller. She stood in the garden beside a man who was trying, and she was herself entirely, and the garden was beautiful, and the evening was real. And that was enough. It was, she thought, and she felt it in the full, settled, specific way that things feel when they are true, more than enough. It was the thing she had been trying to get to, through 3 years of careful management and distance, and invisible mornings and walls at galas, and a half-packed bag in a cedar chest. She had gotten here. She was here. The roses held their second bloom in the October light. The fountain ran. She stayed.